Welcome to this CXO Vision interview with myself, Ben Leitch, and Rob Lee of the SANS Institute. Welcome, Rob. Thank you for joining us. Uh,
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
could you just start by introducing yourself to our viewers, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rob T. Lee. I'm the Chief AI Officer and the Chief of Research at the SANS Institute. Been in and around the industry, focusing on digital forensics, offensive operations, and security operations for a long time now, and really starting to focusing on AI, cybersecurity, and what it means for the industry.
So, the focus of today's interview is going to be around the SANS 2025 GCC Cybersecurity Threat Landscape Report. So, could we just start by you telling us what the primary goal of this report was?
Well, it's overall to be able to get a snapshot from, those organizations and just like a lot of other surveys, understanding threat landscape, how organizations are taking a look at the different data, what is, crucial to them to be able to make organizational decisions. Cybersecurity, and, I hate to use, it almost sounds like a marketing term, is consistently evolving. And, understanding how organizations are looking at it, really helps them out and be able to do peer analysis to be able to see, are we, unique? Are we, the same? Am I, looking at things in a similar vein? Are we missing things completely? So, this comparative analysis really helps, organizations be able to assess and potentially redo their strategy based on what the industry is showing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely an interesting read. I can't wait to delve into it a bit more. So, 32% of respondents say that they don't know how many attacks they've experienced. So, what do you think this visibility gap tells us about the state of detection capabilities in the region and why this matters more potentially than the attacks themselves?
The and again, you end up taking a look at the numbers. So, a third. I actually think the number, is likely much higher. Just, people have a hard time admitting that. Granted, I think this is true for the entire industry. Is like you can't defend against what you don't see, but also you only know what is, potentially known. With AI attacks on the, increase, the velocity of these attacks and how fast that they're moving ends up potentially creating a new area that's, going to create an additional visibility gap. And on top of that, most networks, they may have, a potential lack of telemetry, so they cannot and have a difficult time distinguishing signal from noise. I mean, it's the same thing going through airport security. You have so many people coming through, and you, of course, hear all these stories about things that get through airport security, which is likely true. So they're after threats that are known, and it's really hard to identify things that are unknown. And the other side to this coin is like organizations who think they know their attack count, but don't actually know that. And so there's this mindset, which almost, comes down the real truth is this may be something that we're always trying to chase, but how do you know what accurate is? Are you comparing against another organization that has different numbers, or are you potentially trying to chase a number that no one really has an idea of what that true number is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I found something very interesting, which was the kind of risk perception to split. So where 26% rated cyber risk is very low and 26 rated it is very high. It was a very funny thing to see. But what do you
Yeah.
think is driving that divergence and which group should we maybe be more worried about?
Well, I mean, both groups concern me, but the split definitely reflects the dramatic different levels of cybersecurity maturity answering the same survey. The very low group, either genuinely mature programs who've reduced risk or organizations who can't see their exposure. Given that 32% visibility gap, most are, probably in category two. The high group, likely organizations with better visibility, actually see what's hitting them, or recently breached organizations who are now acutely aware of what they missed. I guess, I'm looking at this, what is the real problem? There's really no convergence. The even distribution across the four categories suggests no shared baselines for assessing cyber risk in the region.
Mm. And following on from the kind of basics of cybersecurity in that region, the sort of budget that cybersecurity is allowed is also a bit of an issue where we see in the report where 27% allocate less than a quarter of their security budget to detection and response. So, given that ransomware and other things are such a growing threat, what is the issue? What's absorbing the rest of company spends?
Well, I mean, the short answer is prevention technologies that don't prevent things that matter the most. And this is, again, when you end up taking a look at that, it's a dynamic that you could throw more money at the problem, but what is the residual returns that you're going to be able to get from that? And maybe to have a better articulation of that, saying, hey, we've invested 50%, and yet we've not been able to reduce, detection and response rates. So, and some of this is just a standard business decision, is where's that soft point that you're going to be able to say the investment is getting the returns that we want, versus doubling the investment, we only get a 2% increase. The typical budget absorption, perimeter defense, a lot of Florida compliance requirements, endpoint protection, network hardware that gets deployed but never tuned, identity projects that take years. To a certain extent, most of the entire business model is built around post initial access activity. So if you're sitting 75% preventing initial access and then 25% detecting lateral movement, privilege escalation, exfiltration staging, you have optimized the wrong threat model. Organizations that handle ransomware best aren't those with, the biggest budgets, but they've rebalanced toward detection and response, and accepted a breach is when, not if equation.
So, moving on to a very hot topic at the moment, which is, of course, AI. And you perhaps might consider yourself a bit of a specialist in this area. But AI and machine learning constantly shows up as the top emerging security challenge and investment. So are security teams trying to defend against AI, deploy AI, or perhaps a combination of both?
I mean, both are, defending against AI and deploying AI. Here's what I've seen across the industry. We in security are always focused on the advanced adversarial threats, nation state actors, ransomware. But for current threats, it's insiders and the employees utilizing AI that's unsanctioned, what they've now called shadow AI. And security teams are really having a hard time wrestling, with, Joe in finance that is uploading, corporate financials to ChatGPT on their personal side. That represents a greater data breach potential than an adversary coming in. Even, from a ransomware attack, what is the liability and what is the insurance payout for someone being, not trained on what they're supposed to be able to look at. But as a result, when we're, deploying security teams, monitoring AI-powered attacks, pressure to deploy AI defensively, securing the AI systems, and, preventing shadow AI, all of these are potentially completely different skill sets. And we need to also take a look at this stuff too, is, we have, adversarial, AI capabilities. China is using Claude Code and moving at a velocity that moves in seconds, not minutes or days, through these networks. So the 22% asking for AI ML training are the honest ones who realize they're operating in all three areas with no depth in any. And that number is way too low at this point. But I think a lot of the teams out there are struggling with security budgets. But the AI budgets that these corporations have is an untapped resource for the security teams to potentially ask for additional funding. There's a risk and governance area almost in every single one of the AI budgets that may be tapped for other, capabilities inside the organization. But even going in there and asking for 5 to 10% of that budget could increase the number of trained individuals across the organization. There's no maturity in AI tools to defend against AI at this point. So really the stopgap is having trained people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see how AI develops even further this year.
Oh, yeah.
And perhaps moving on to a similar, perhaps popular thing is cloud security, and cloud security specialists and penetration testers are equally in demand. However, if you look at the other people who aren't in demand, it's security architects. But given that architecture is kind of a top training priority at the moment, why aren't organizations actually hiring for it?
Well, it's hiring training gap. Organizations say they need architecture, but then hire tactically. Cloud specialists, pen testers, solve immediate problems with clear deliverables, and hiring managers, know specifically how to evaluate them. Security architects are strategic. They design the systems, won't need emergency fixes later. The impact is harder to measure, skills harder to evaluate. Success in many cases is invisible. So organizations recognize, that they need security architecture. That's why it's the top training priority, and 19%. They want to upskill the existing staff, but when hiring, they default to tactical needs because fires are burning. And good architects are extremely expensive and rare. The talent competition with local budgets, it's easier to hire pen testers at market rates than pay architect the premiums. So, long-term consequences, keep building without architectural oversight, then hire tactical people to fix predictable problems. That's, what this is ends up being in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting food for thought. But perhaps moving on to vulnerabilities and what downtime means for companies. So system vulnerabilities and patching tops the ICS and OT concerns. But in environments where you often can't patch without shutting down production, what are organizations doing about this?
Oof. I mean, you take a look at what's going on worldwide. The vulnerabilities of these systems are some of the easiest to potentially say, that it's repeatable, that I would be able to, with a great assurance, be able to affect some of these networks. You look what happened just with the, Operation Absolute Resolve in Venezuela, with what U.S. cyber forces were able to do, a complete takedown of the power grid there. And they would never execute that unless they had 100% reliability that would, achieve success. Way too many dynamics in there for them to potentially risk lives otherwise. So as a result, this is one of the hardest problems in cybersecurity. And most organizations are doing a lot less than they should in this. But when you end up taking a look at this, the dilemma is real. SCADA systems that were built on old Windows XP controlling processes, are controlling processes, across, the entire the network. You can't patch those systems anymore. Those systems are completely vulnerable. To upgrade those systems, you are potentially looking at, control systems that are, no longer in manufacturing. They're basically hard coded into the network, and you're, kind of left with what you have. It's kind of like you're, rolling through an older neighborhood, in Europe or other locations where, you see plumbing attached to the outside of the houses, electrical, covered by, rubber wire. It's, you're dealing with infrastructure that's not exactly designed for the modern era. And so as a result, how do you defend against something that essentially is old and antiquated, but can't easily be replaced? I always made a joke in this area. I said, some cases it's easier to wish for a fire that burns the entire infrastructure to the ground, so you have to start from scratch and have to rebuild it. In some cases, because then you'll be able to get the insurance payment for it too. In some cases, that is much easier to defend operations than otherwise. So what organizations have to do, kind of falls into three categories. They compensating the controls, segmentation, strict access controls, enhanced monitoring, even on these nodes. Risk-based prioritization, identify what actually needs patching and what can be protected in other ways. In most cases, if you're dealing with older capabilities, it's heavy monitoring to be able to see when the bad happens. The honest answer for many is hope is a strategy, which you're hoping nothing bad happens. But in reality, that is, definitively not going to be the case. I mean, adversaries know these systems are hard to patch. And when it comes down to it, this is not going to be an easy playing field for any organizations that's having to defend against ICS OT networks. It's going to be consistent vigilance. And the other challenge with this is that hiring trained individuals, when in many cases these utilities are, you're dealing with networks that don't have a massive amount of funds. How do you compete on the market where these are very niche trained individuals as well? It's a problem that is not easily solved.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a big challenge for sure. And I'd like to end by kind of focusing on the GCC region. So in a region with a documented nation state threat activity, only about a third of organizations you found check for regional threats quarterly at best. So what is the realistic exposure window that that sort of lack of constant awareness creates?
It's that was one of the most surprising things about the report. And I kind of wonder maybe they didn't understand the question. I don't know. That's one of those sometimes it's not the data, it's, maybe the, misunderstanding of like what was being asked, but let's assume they did, um, exposure windows are measured in much smaller time frames, and the attack timeline, the compression of these, especially with potentially utilizing AI, is going from months to weeks. In many cases, it's going to be shortened to days. And this is again where AI may, essentially be helpful here, is that the reason why you do it, annually or quarterly is the amount of time. Plus, you end up getting, the people doing this, will sit there and like, okay, I'm going to go do the same thing. It's kind of like walking the perimeter every single night. It becomes very monotonous. AI is not going to find it monotonous. It's going to, consistently be monitoring and going through this and doing, this stuff on a daily basis or even hourly that you potentially look at. So, I think AI is going to essentially help this issue. We're definitely not there yet, but, keep your eye on the horizon for, be able to do continuous capability and monitoring. Now, the GCC, documented a ton of nation state activities, different objectives, a ton of espionage across the board, a lot of pre-positioning for potential conflicts. The thing that comes down to it is that they're being very steady. They're not in a hurry. And quarterly monitoring gives them plenty of time to be able to achieve their operational success, and you never even know they're there. The 35% doing daily, weekly monitoring and giving themselves better chance to detect activity in progress. But now moving from quarterly, getting in that window of 3 months, now you're moving from daily to weekly. And with AI capabilities infusing the offensive teams, we're now down to seconds and minutes. So they're still potentially able to slip under the rug without anyone noticing, that they're potentially in there. Then they go silent. It's kind of like, I always make the analogy, what ends up happening here is that you have a 5 minute window. It's kind of like Mission Impossible, where someone, inserts themselves inside the building and inserts a bug. Now you exit the building as long as there's nothing there in there that's changed, like the standard burglars, flip tables over looking for something. But if you install, something for espionage in there, or something that it says, if X, then take down, the water supply to the, to the unit. Those things are extremely hard to detect because they're not moving. They're not causing a lot of noise. They're just sitting and waiting for that, thing to be able to occur. And this is where, really doing proper threat hunting and leaning forward into some of this stuff, continually looking for these, capabilities that have been inserted. Those organizations are going to fare better, but that takes a massive amount of effort and time. And that's one of the reasons why organizations that have it down to daily, weekly, the costs skyrocket. Whereas those who are doing quarterly, they're potentially balancing, like we said earlier in the report, with other budgetary concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks very much for your comments today, Rob. That is all.
Yeah, thank you.